What's the deal with Christians? Christianity, what's this thing called the fall? We're going to spend a little bit of time here because, and it'll go beyond this video, and we're going to explore what Christians mean by the fall. And the reason I'm going to do that is because the fall provides the backdrop and the essential background information as to why salvation is necessary and evangelism is required. Now, if someone who doesn't believe this stuff has read Genesis 3, he or she will probably think something like this. What? They get thrown out of the Garden of Eden for eating a piece of fruit? What kind of a harsh God is that? That will form an excuse in their minds to ridicule and dismiss the Christian view of the fall and of God himself. So we have to dig a little bit deeper to understand what's really going on in Genesis 3. Now, first, we have to recognize that there was an agreement in place between God and humanity, Adam and Eve. If you have to read Genesis 2 and Isaiah 24 and Hosea 6 to get this point. But for our purposes, we need to know that this agreement, which is in the Bible called a covenant, it is an agreement that had certain stipulations and certain promises, threats upon disobedience, promises upon obedience. So we need to know what this entailed. God gave Adam and Eve two commands and one prohibition. The two commands are in chapter 2, verse 15 of Genesis: to work the ground and to keep. In most translations, it says keep, but it really should be translated guard the garden. Now, that second command is important because the first part of Adam and Eve's fall is that they allowed Satan, who was controlling a serpent, into the garden, and they didn't kick him out. The prohibition that God put into place is that there was only one tree from which they could not eat. They could eat from every other tree, but they could not eat from this one tree. And if they did eat from it, they would surely die. Obedience and disobedience had actually the highest possible consequences attached to them. If Adam and Eve were to obey, the implication is that they would live. If they don't eat, they will live. If they eat, they will die. And from 1 Corinthians chapter 15, we learn that they would have gone beyond their current state to a much better one. But if they disobeyed, they would die. God told them these things. So at stake is not just a clear prohibition about this one tree, but it's also the truth of God's own words. The covenantal agreement then was about much more than a mere piece of fruit. It was about whether Adam and Eve would obey the words of God, believe those words, and retain their allegiance to God in that covenantal agreement. And as we know, they did none of those things. They let Satan into the garden and didn't drive him out. They did not believe God's word, but instead they believed Satan's words, which were utter lies. And they broke the covenantal agreement and they forged a new relationship, and even maybe you could call it a new covenant with Satan. But how do we know that Satan lied? Well, the Hebrew is quite clear that he did. God said in chapter 2, verse 17, "But of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat, for in the day that you eat of it, you shall surely die." But then in chapter 3, verse 4, Satan says, "You shall not surely die." So Satan takes the direct words of God and quotes them, but adds the word not in order to negate those words directly. Satan also lied about what Adam and Eve already had. He told them, "You will be like God, knowing good and evil," implying that they were not like God at the time. But we know from chapters 1 and 2 that Adam and Eve were made in the image of God. They were like God. So Adam and Eve, though, believed Satan's lies, and especially the one that implied that they were not like God and that eating the fruit would make them like God, knowing good and evil, probably meaning determining good and evil for themselves. So the lure was that of autonomy, being a law unto themselves, being able to say, well, no one tells me what to do. I get to decide what I'm going to do myself. And humanity has not changed very much since then. Now, it might still be in your mind that the punishment seems out of all proportion to the crime. Let me give you an illustration that might help. Supposing you're walking along the street and for some reason you slap the homeless person who is located on the corner of the street. What will be the consequences of doing that? Well, probably not that much. The homeless person might be used to such treatment, might just sit there and say, oh, well, another day, another slap. But what would happen if that same action was done against your neighbor? Well, you might then get into a fist fight because your neighbor might not be used to getting slapped by you. What would then happen if you slapped a police officer? Well, now you're going to jail for assaulting an officer of the law. What happens if you were to slap the president of the United States? Well, that's treason, and the consequences are even more severe. What I hope you can see is that the consequences of the exact same action, slapping somebody, differ dramatically depending on the dignity and position of the person you slap. Now imagine that every single sin, every single time you do something that's wrong, that's opposed to God's law, that every single one of those is a slap in the face of the creator of the universe, your own creator, someone who has infinite dignity. The penalty for even the smallest offense then would not depend so much on the nature of the offense, but far more on the dignity of the God against whom you have sinned. And see, that's the primary reason why Adam and Eve's eating of the forbidden fruit brought with it such drastic consequences. Although, as we will see, God not only delayed part of the punishment, but even gave them a promise that there would be grace and salvation from this sad state of affairs. So what I hope you can start to see is a brief glimpse into the scope of humanity's problem, which is far greater than most people would like to admit.